My name is Carlin Burisenko, and you're listening to the Actively Unwoke podcast. You can access full archives of the podcast over on my Substack, Carlin, Karlyn, .substack.com. And if you want to support the work I'm doing and keep me in business, because I am 100% grassroots funded by you, please consider signing up for a membership for $8 a month, $80 a year. You get a variety of perks when you do that, and I really, really appreciate it. I can't do this without you. So less than an hour ago, I got done listening to Joe Biden's official address confirming that he is dropping out of the presidential race. And listen, there's a lot I could do commentary on right now. I could talk about the fact that I didn't really think this was any big surprise. I don't think anyone that's tuned in politically thought this was a surprise. I think that most of us have been well aware that Joe Biden has had dementia since before he got elected. And I think most of us have been well aware that it's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. I do think it was probably a really big shock for the left or people who've been in a leftist echo chamber to see Joe Biden at the debate he did with Donald Trump, because it was just absolutely obvious that he was not capable of functioning at the level that he needs to function in order to be the chief executive of the United States, which is why he ended up dropping out. But I don't want to do a big analysis on that. I think that's all been done before. I don't want to do a big analysis on the idiocy of passing the torch to Kamala Harris. And no, Kamala Harris is not a socialist. She's not actually that far left. Kamala Harris is just incompetent, but she will enact far left policies if she gets elected. And Lord help us all if the Democrats cheat their way into that. But putting all that aside, also ignoring the fact that I'm not even sure that was actually Joe Biden giving that speech tonight. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist or something, but I don't really think that was actually him. I really think that was some sort of AI deep fake because it just looked really weird. It wasn't looking into the camera. Joe Biden knows how to use a teleprompter and look into the camera. It's just, it was weird. It was weird. But putting aside all that, there is actually one really important thing I want to make sure people understand about that speech. And that's when Joe Biden said, or fake Joe Biden or whatever that was when Joe Biden said he wants to work on Supreme Court reform in his remaining months in office. Now, let me lead with the good news. I don't actually think they're going to be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish with the Supreme Court in the next 6 months. So I don't want anyone to freak out. I want to put that right up front. I don't think there's time to do it. I don't think this isn't really a topic that they've been focused on at all. And it would require a dang near Herculean effort to get anywhere close to achieving what I think they want to achieve in 6 months. Not even a Herculean effort. It's an impossible effort. I don't think it's actually possible. So I just want to make sure that's very clear before I get into this topic, because what Joe Biden is talking about is actually pretty scary. When he says Supreme Court reform, what I think they mean is the Democrats have been wanting to pack the Supreme Court ever since Donald Trump left office. What's happened is Donald Trump got to put 3 new Supreme Court justices on the court during his term. Joe Biden's only gotten 1. And what that means is the court is extremely imbalanced in terms of it has a right-leaning bias. It has a conservative bias, which for our intents and purposes, and this doesn't matter if you are on the left or a disaffected lefty or libertarian or even a conservative, because I have a wide variety of people in my audience. For our purposes in terms of stopping the far left cultural revolution, this is ideal, to be honest, because we have the Supreme Court in place as one of those checks on the executive, as one of those checks on the legislative branch, and the Supreme Court is holding up pretty well, maybe not perfectly, but pretty well in terms of being that thing that can really stem and mitigate against a lot of far left policies, right? And this is why the left hates the Supreme Court. Well, it actually goes back a little bit more than that. I mean, from a far left perspective, we hear radical revolutionary socialists all the time talk about the need to abolish the Supreme Court, abolish the United States Senate, abolish the Electoral College, even really scrap the idea of a president as we know it. That would not exist in the leftist utopia. And I know that not everyone listening to this podcast follows along with the radical far left content that I cover all the time, but just rest assured that what goes on the radical far left, the radical revolutionary socialist far left, that all trickles down into the progressives and to the Democrat Party. And so it kind of dilutes itself as it trickles down. That's why I often remind people that Democrats are not socialists. Democrats aren't really far leftists. A lot of people think they are because they've been lied to by conservative media, but they aren't. They're two very, very different things. Democrats are a significantly lighter version of what the actual protesters and actual activists want to do. Progressives are not socialists. Liberals are not socialists. In fact, real socialists laugh at the idea of having anything to do with the Democrats. They hate the Democrats and the liberals and the progressives, and that includes AOC and Bernie Sanders. They hate them even more than they hate the right. But everything that the left does eventually trickles down into the more mainstream leftist and, more centrist, moderate political institutions, just because the far left is so powerful. It is so influential. It's much more than people think. And so what the far left believes when it comes to the idea of democracy is when they use the term democracy, they don't mean the current system as we have it now. They do not believe that we live in a democracy in the United States. What they mean is, when they say democracy, they mean socialism. They mean the future socialist utopia. That is what they're saying when they say they want democracy. It is not the system we currently have. It is the future Marxist utopia system. Why do they believe socialism represents democracy? Because under their socialist system, every person would get a far more powerful say in what happens. And so the reason that they want to abolish things like the Supreme Court, like the Electoral College, like the Senate, is that it doesn't give people a one-for-one influence in what's going on. Because, of course, the Electoral College is based off of the population of a state, right? That takes power away from the people, or so the left believes. So the Supreme Court, obviously, is an unelected body. It is an appointed body. And so that's not something they consider to be a component of democracy. The Senate is the same thing. Every state gets 2 senators. So that means that it's not a direct vote from the people. The only thing that kind of comes close that I think that they would keep some version of is more a House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives isn't perfect, but it's closer to the kind of like governing council idea that the far left has. And forget about the presidency. If the far left wins, there will be no more president as we know it. They're actually trying to wipe out basically the entire Constitution and replace it with what would uphold the ideals of the Marxist utopia. So in order to do that, they need to abolish a number of institutions. Now, the best way to abolish the Supreme Court, the easiest way, is to start to pack the court. Because once you start packing the court, you basically get into an arms race where, like, if the Democrats are capable of packing the court now or doing the Supreme Court reform as Joe Biden wants to do, then what's going to happen when a Republican administration comes in? They're just going to do the same thing. They're just going to add more justices to it. And then what happens when the Democrat administration comes back, as it inevitably would? They would just add more until the Supreme Court is an overwhelming body that doesn't even make sense anymore. You destroy the thing by, quote unquote, reforming the thing. So this is honestly one of the areas where Joe Biden could, if he were more competent and capable, do a fair bit of damage. And now, and this is why I wanted to preface at the beginning by saying I don't actually think they're going to be able to do this. I just don't think they have the time to do it. I think it might be more of a bone out to their base to say, we heard your cries to pack the court, because the Democrat cries to pack the Supreme Court have been going on since before Joe Biden got elected, quite frankly. This is something the base really wants, because the base eventually wants to, well, not the base, the far left wants to eventually abolish the Supreme Court and get rid of it entirely so that it is no longer a check on their power, because the Supreme Court is the thing that gets in the way of them doing something based on equity. I mean, look at the affirmative action ruling that came out, was it last year, I believe, where the Supreme Court essentially struck down affirmative action in university admissions. That was a blow to the left. You can look at Roe v. Wade. I mean, the Supreme Court striking down Roe v. Wade and sending that back to the states. So that was a massive blow to the left. Now, they used that to their advantage. They turned around and they raised millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars off of it and basically won the 2022 midterms off of the fundraising they did based on the abortion issue alone, which is why the right needs to stop going after this issue, because every time the right goes after this issue, the left ends up winning. Like, you already got your repeal of Roe v. Wade. Can we move on already? Because every time you complain about abortion, the left wins and the left raises more money, and you're going to get closer to it actually being nationalized, and that's when the fun really begins. So the Supreme Court is not the left's friend, and the left knows this. They're the thing that stand in the way between them getting the Marxist utopia that they want, where everyone has universal health care and we make decisions based on equity, like, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Equity is basically the idea of redistribution of wealth, redistribution of resources. The Supreme Court's not going to allow them to do that. So the only way that they can really get what they want is to get rid of this specific governing body. And one of the best ways to get rid of it, as we've already discussed, is to make it ineffective and nonsensical by starting this arms race of packing the court and having just go back and forth between each side until the size of the Supreme Court just gets to be untenable and the public no longer has faith in the institution. Now, that might seem like something you might be saying, like, Carlin, that sounds like a really long-term strategy, but that's how the left thinks. The left doesn't expect that Joe Biden's going to snap his dementia-ridden fingers and be able to overthrow the Supreme Court, but what he can do is make small changes right now that move towards that direction. It's the battle of inches. That's what the long march through the institutions was. The left spent 100 years taking over every major institution in the country by getting jobs and then staying in those jobs until you got promoted and promoted again and promoted again and promoted again to these positions where you have a lot of power to change things and change policy and cause problems, but are really difficult to be fired from. They did this in government. They did this in colleges and universities. They did this in K through 12 schools. They did this in media. They did this in entertainment. They did this all over the place. And this is why the left controls institutions. They always played the long game. It wasn't just about the instant gratification of getting a new Supreme Court justice, although they'll take it. They'll take it if they can get it. I mean, if Joe Biden is able to figure out some way to pack the court or do any of these other things, I saw someone else say they were trying to do term limits for the Supreme Court, which also isn't going to work. But even if they get one of these wins, I mean, like, it's going to feel good for them. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the real high level vision of why they're doing it. It's just 1 inch. They've gained an inch. And then tomorrow they'll gain another inch, and tomorrow they'll gain another one after that, and so on and so forth. That is how the left wins. They implement long-term strategies that over the course of time give them the power to completely erode the institutions that are holding up the American system. And they're going to do this with the Supreme Court. They're going to do this with the Senate. They're going to do this with the Electoral College. They're going to do it with the presidency, just in the same way that they've done it with the K through 12 schools. There was a time, and I know it wasn't that long ago, and some of you may even remember it, there was a time when kids actually used to learn how to read in K through 12 schools and write and do math and do basic life skills. That no longer happens for a significant portion of the public. I saw a poll the other day, or maybe it wasn't a poll, but some sort of study that said, what was it? I think it was like 20% of the public is completely illiterate. Really think about that for a second. 20% of the American public is illiterate? How did that happen? How did we allow that to happen? Well, it happened because the left took over higher education, and when the left took over higher education, that gave them the colleges of education where the teachers are trained. And almost every teacher teaching in public school today had to go through an education program at a college in order to become a teacher, and they own all of this, and they've owned all of this for decades. This wasn't something that just happened yesterday. It wasn't something that happened under Obama. This was something that has been going on since the 60s. Is when they really started pushing into education. It's been going on a long, 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 long time. It's going on 60 years. It's been going on more than most of us have been alive. So when Joe Biden said Supreme Court reform in his speech tonight, I don't think he's actually going to be successful at packing the court, but I do think he can put things in place and make progress towards what is going to be required to pack the court. And, we all have to cross our fingers and hope that I really think the only way that Kamala is going to get elected president is if the left really cheats in a very overt way. So it's one of those things like, can you really cross your fingers and pray? Because I really think that's only going to happen if there's just massive, massive, massive fraud that goes on, which it very well could, because guess what? The Republicans haven't really done much to fix the electoral system since 2020. They talked a good game. They screamed a good game on Twitter. They complained about it all the time. They made movies about it. They did shows about it. But did they actually do anything to fix it? No, they really didn't. So I guess we'll see. What happens, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew what they meant by Supreme Court reform and why they meant it. And if you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments on the Substack. I do pay attention to the comments, guys. I will answer them if there are questions on there. And again, you can find this Substack article by going over to the Substack, Karlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. There is a link up in the upper menu and it just says podcast. And the Actively Unwoke podcast that you're listening to right now is not to be confused with the Inner Circle podcast, which is a supporter-only podcast. I know I like to make things difficult. But if you just click on the podcast link, you will find the archive of all the Actively Unwoke podcasts. And you can leave a comment, you can ask questions, stuff like that. And again, while you are over on the Substack, I do hope you will consider supporting the work I'm doing. $8 a month, $80 a year does keep me in business. You get a variety of perks, including Zoom calls with me every week that are private, that are unrecorded. You get access to the supporter Discord. We have our writers group on there for creatives. We do movie nights on Sunday night where we get together and watch a movie and do trivia, and it's awesome. And of course, you allow me to create the content that I create on the Substack, on YouTube, on Rumble, on Twitter, doing everything I do every single day to try to help you guys understand the left in this country. I really appreciate you allowing me to do it. That's all I have for this time. Take care, guys. We'll see you soon.